This is Barry Zalma, Zalma's Insurance Fraud Letter. Today we're speaking about Volume 25, Issue 20, the October 15 edition of Zalma's Insurance Fraud Letter. The fraud letter contains many different stories and articles and reports of criminal convictions for insurance fraud. And we'll start with the case of a criminal who caused a suit on a policy to drag on for more than 6 years, proving that even when an insurance company establishes that its insured has committed fraud, it is not done with that insured. United States District Judge Gary R. Brown was faced with a legal dispute that, perhaps because the defendant was a criminal, went on for years without a final disposition. In Principal Life Insurance Company versus Jason P. Brand, the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York was called upon to determine whether or not to finally resolve a case that had gone on for 7 years. And in doing so, it stated that the disputes that appeared to be relatively straightforward were finally to be resolved. 1. Defendant Brand obtained a disability policy early in 2012 from Plaintiff Principal Life after being less than forthcoming about his health history. In June of 2014, prior to the submission of defendant's disability claim on November 14, 2014, the New York State Attorney General's office raided the defendant's offices, seizing his computer and physical files, leading to indictment on October 16, 2014, of defendant and his businesses DASO Development Corp and Narco Freedom, Inc. for insurance fraud in the first degree and grand larceny in the second degree, charges to which the defendant would eventually plead guilty. The defendant filed a disability claim based upon anxiety, perhaps because he was about to go to jail. Principal Life, for its part, acted quickly and rescinded the policy and filed a declaratory relief action. The litigation has been pending since. The case in which defendant was originally unrepresented yielded an unconscionable level of overlitigation which added unneeded complexity. After more than 6 years of litigation, hundreds of court filings, and approximately 75 orders issued by at least 5 different judicial officers, the case was placed before Magistrate Judge Wicks. Amidst this chaos, Judge Wicks issued a report and recommendations to United States District Judge Brown regarding summary judgment motions by both parties. His findings and conclusions were straightforward and simple. 1. The plain language of the policy prevented plaintiff from rescinding the policy in absence of a judicial determination of fraud. And 2, the claimed disability indisputably emanating from defendant's criminal conduct were expressly excluded from coverage. Judge Brown concluded that Judge Wicks' report, introducing clarity to the morass created by the litigants, should well end the case. But the pandemonium continued, with both parties disputing the recommendation of Judge Wicks. Both parties objected on several far-flung grounds. But eventually, Eventually, Judge Brown concluded, in a Solomon-like fashion, quote, "Enough ink has been spilled, effort expended, and resources consumed in this case. For the reasons set forth above, the court hereby adopts the recommendations of Judge Wicks in its entirety, and the clerk shall enter judgment in favor of plaintiff consistent with this order and close the case. In the opinion of Ziffel, people who commit insurance fraud are egregiously litigious. To drag out the case for more than 6 years before more than 5 judges is difficult to understand. To argue against a win, as did the insurer, is simply silly, and the insurer should refuse to pay the fees of counsel who filed the objections. The case was simple. The insured was a criminal whose claim of disability resulted from his criminal conduct and was therefore freely, clearly, and unambiguously excluded. I was surprised that Judge Brown did not assess sanctions on the parties and their counsel for wasting the time of the court with an excruciatingly over-litigated case. The issue also covers wisdom from great men and women, and then an article about a proactive insurer who found it had the right to renew a judgment against a convicted fraudster. In People of the State of California XREL Interinsurance Exchange of the Auto Club, the insurer's $7,870,557.89 judgment against a fraudster was renewed by the Auto Club since it had been unable to collect the money, and the court's attempt to renew that judgment was fought tooth and nail by the fraudster. The court eventually denied the criminal's motion to vacate the renewal of the judgment and affirmed the original default judgment. An interinsurance exchange was also entitled to recover its costs on appeal. In the opinion of Zalma's insurance fraud letter, insurance fraud is estimated to take from the insurance industry between $80 and $300 billion every year. No one really knows. Mr. Mirsky, the criminal in this case, and the plaintiff or defendant trying to keep the judgment off the books, was a major player in fraudulent insurance schemes and was convicted of crimes relating to the fraud in both state and federal court. The Auto Club, a major victim of his crime, filed a qui tam suit and obtained a judgment of almost $8 million and has been adding interest to that judgment since it was entered. Since he was in prison, attempts to execute on the judgment was delayed, and the court renewed the judgment only to find Mirsky attempting to avoid paying the judgment and fighting in trial and in the appellate court. The court properly held him to the judgment and allowed the interinsurance exchange to start work again to collect the judgment on its behalf and on behalf of the state of California. This issue also discusses insurance education from Barry Zalma and Claim School, Inc., good news of convictions from the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud, a rather long list of convictions of health insurance fraud perpetrators, indicating that the Department of Justice has finally given up on its lack of action because of the pandemic and is now arresting, trying, and convicting people like the ringleader of a drug ring and his son, who were sentenced for trafficking prescription pills, a South Florida man who pleaded guilty to consecutive health care fraud conspiracies, a pharmacist who was sentenced to nearly 6 years in prison for fraud, an ophthalmologist who pleaded guilty to using misbranded medications, a Kentucky psychiatrist who pleaded guilty to healthcare fraud, a Missouri pharmacy and its owner who agreed to pay $1,500,000 to avoid criminal fraud charges, a former office manager who was sentenced to 12 months in prison after admitting she stole $813,000 through false billing, a Turkish national who pleaded guilty to conspiracy in birth tourism schemes whose clients' births were paid for by Medicaid and Medi-Cal. 3 generic pharmaceutical companies who agreed to pay almost $500 million to resolve alleged False Claims Act liability, bringing the total payments for this fraud fixing to nearly $900 million. A corrupt department head at Walter Reed, who was sentenced to federal prison for accepting cash, event tickets, and other gratuities from a Maryland company that received more than $25 million in government business. A story about a woman who pleaded guilty to conspiracy to defraud the United States in a medical kickback scheme. A report of a Center City doctor who pleaded guilty to illegally distributing controlled substances, filing false tax returns, and also agreed to pay $4 million to resolve the civil and related actions to his criminal conviction. And Ziffel wonders why a 79-year-old physician would do this serious crime for cash after a long career as a physician, and finds it difficult to understand he profited so much that he kept more than $1.8 million in cash in his home that was forfeited and still was able to pay the fines and restitution demanded. He should and probably will spend the rest of his life in prison in exchange for the lives he ruined, as well as the money he cost the government. Then there's the story of the pharmacy owner who pleaded guilty to federal charges involving the vaccination of minors under 12 with the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine. A story about how a jury convicted a Tennessee doctor of 36 counts related to his pill mill operation. A story about a Miami man sentenced for health care fraud and a kickback scheme. A story of a Dominican national sentenced for trafficking fentanyl, health care fraud, ID theft, misuse of a social security number. A Virginia doctor who pleaded guilty to a $1.8 million health care fraud scheme. A California woman who was sentenced in a multi-million-dollar Medicare fraud scheme. A pain doctor who was convicted of over $100 million health care fraud scheme. A South Hills, Pennsylvania pharmacist who pleaded guilty to healthcare fraud conspiracy, fraudulently obtaining controlled substances and mishandling drugs. Then there's explanations about other fraud convictions, including a former Georgia insurance commissioner who was sentenced to 7 years in prison for defrauding insurers and customers of insurers, a Pennsylvania man who was sentenced for insurance fraud after staging a motor vehicle accident, how Allstate obtained a judgment against fraudsters of more than $16 million, what to know about a mother-in-law murderer before the return of Snapped Behind Bars, a TV show, and a story about an insurance fraudster ordered to pay nearly 5 times what the government proved he collected. The newsletter also discussed free insurance law videos and information about new books on insurance claims and insurance fraud available from Zalma Insurance Fraud Letter and from Zalma on Insurance, the website. A listing of the last 10 blog postings from Zalma on Insurance, and information about why insurance fraud costs everyone. This video was a short statement of what can be found in Zalma's Insurance Fraud Letter, available October 15, 2021, and is available at the website Zalma.com and can be viewed on YouTube, on Rumble.com, and on Substack, where it will be published and is published in full. If you found the video to be useful and the newsletter, please subscribe to Zalma on Insurance Fraud so that you can receive a PDF version of the newsletter in your email box. If you've found this video to be useful or interesting to you, please pass it on to your colleagues so that they can also learn about insurance fraud. And please subscribe to Zalma's Insurance Fraud Letter, the blog Zalma on Insurance, my Substack publications, my YouTube publications, where you could please click on the link button, and my Rumble.com publications, where you should click on the Rumble button. Thank you for your attention.